Okay. Hello. So I'm here with Dr. Colin Maitland, a professor at the College of Information Sciences and Technology at Penn State University, as well as a board member in the United Nations University Institute in Macau. She researches IT use in organizations providing humanitarian assistance and fostering economic and social development. I've discovered her through her work on refugee mobile phone use, specifically in refugee camps. It was fascinating, and we thought she was the perfect person to talk to. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here, Colin.
Thank you.
So your research often focuses on information and communication technologies and how refugees use it. So let's start pretty simple. What are the main ways refugees use technology?
Well, I think it's hard to say main ways, just as
Yeah.
it would be for us, right? I mean, refugees are people who have many diverse information needs, which are in some ways similar to people on the move in all parts of the world. I mean, when they arrive in a refugee camp or settlement, they've moved. They may need to find healthcare providers. They may need to find social services. They may need to arrange for their children to go to school. And so these are tasks that we find many of ourselves engaged in when we move. Now, of course,
Mm.
refugees are especially vulnerable. And in some cases, because many refugee settlements are geographically located in remote regions, typically close to borders, sometimes the connectivity that is available is limited. And so there can be a big difference between the availability of connectivity from one camp to another. And that may depend on um, how long the camp has existed.
Mm.
We do see that when a camp has existed for a long time, that there can be acceptable access there. But certainly in new emerging crises, that can be one of the first challenges, really, that both the aid organizations and the refugees themselves face is the lack of connectivity. Yeah, so it's a very complicated question, and we see too. We were just looking the other day. My research team and I were looking at a recent crisis in the eastern DRC, which is causing an influx of Congolese refugees into Rwanda. And interestingly, uh, the aid and the housing of the refugees is occurring at a center that had previously housed refugees in that area. And so, you have the situation where you have a new influx, but the infrastructure to serve them was something that was used previously and then sadly had been decommissioned, but now is in being stood up again. And so even in the case of recent incursions, we may find that previous assistance structures help in terms of their access.
Okay. Oh yeah, yeah, that makes complete sense. Okay. Um, so in your article on information sources and anxiety amongst refugees in Kenya
Hmm.
regarding COVID-19,
Yeah.
you highlighted the role of the news of on the internet, like news on the internet,
Hmm.
ameliorating different anxieties related to the pandemic. Um, do ICTs have an impact on refugees' access to communication, to information? Sorry.
Oh,
Yeah.
certainly, certainly. I mean, that is, we have both technical and non-technical means of accessing information.
Mm.
And so, I know that in refugee response, there is an effort to uh, kind of support all means of information access. The use of community mobilizers, for instance, is a very popular way of providing access to information through non-technical means. And I think it is important that aid agencies, the UN and their partners, and also host communities and local governments, host governments understand the potential negative impacts that misinformation disseminated through information and communication technologies can cause. It used to be in a if we had a no technical access available, the community mobilizers would be the primary source of information. But where we have lots of connectivity, which is also typical in many cases, then we have many times the number of sources of information, and that can be that can lead to some problems. Disinformation and rumors are people are very susceptible to them, especially when they're displaced because they're the normal social networks that they may use to triangulate and validate the information. And you say, "Oh, I heard this online." You might ask your neighbors, you might ask your family, "Hey, have you heard this? Do you think this is real?" But when your neighbors are unknown to you and your family is no longer around you, how do you validate information that you see online? I think this is an area where we need to understand the kind of intersection of displacement, social disconnection caused by displacement, and information validation. I think is an important and under-researched area.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. That because TSF works, like we have these connected screens that display information, but that's specifically in collective centers. And refugee camps, this is very much like another story, right? So
Right,
I think research on it is
right,
really, really
right,
essential. Yeah.
right. And we also have to think about connectivity and access to information. Refugee populations are extremely heterogeneous, right? So one of the things that we saw, say, for example, in the Syrian crisis, is that Syrian refugees, and we would certainly find that to be the case with the Ukrainians as well, are much wealthier than the average refugee. I would expect that people coming out of, say, the Eastern Congo, where there has just been decades of conflict and it's so hard to get a leg up economically there, that the people arriving from the Congo are going to be in a much worse situation in so many ways, but also including in their access to information and communication technology. So I just wanted to also make sure that we understand that referring to refugees as a whole is not it's problematic in some ways, and then even among those even within those communities, there's heterogeneity in terms of their wealth, their access to information, their digital skills, and that's also something that we need to consider.
Yeah, education level, I would imagine too.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. I mean, I've worked in refugee camp, and you have people with master's degrees in computer science next to people who didn't finish primary school. It is a very much like a collapse in the kind of socioeconomic structures from where they came from.
Okay. You used the Zaatari. Am I
Yeah,
saying it right?
Zaatari.
Zaatari. Okay. You used the Zaatari refugee camp as a case study on refugee mobile phone use, and you mentioned there that there is frustration around access to mobile services. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, and that was there were a couple of dimensions to that. That was kind of what we might refer to as a greenfield site for refugee settlement. So that refugee camp was built from scratch. And so when I was doing my field work there, it was in relatively early days. And so the way that the communication network had been built out, it was really just an extension of an existing rural infrastructure, and with the tens of thousands of people living in the camp, it was not sufficient, right? They really needed to build out the network there. and take into account some terrain differences and kind of the structures of the refugee camp itself. There were more kind of densely populated areas in the camp, just like we see in any kind of semi-urban environment. And so there were some frustrations there. It also turned out that now I haven't kept up with what the current state is in the connectivity there, but at a time there was a throttling of the data services there. And presumably that was due to some security concerns that the government had, and so mobile data had been available and then was pretty much turned off, even though it wasn't officially turned off.
Oh, yeah, very unstable then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so how can camp-based refugees access mobile services in such unstable conditions?
Yeah,
How do they manage?
that's a challenge. That's the challenge, and again, depending on the environment. So, for example, in Jordan, movement was very constrained for refugees. So, refugees, in order to leave that camp, had to apply for a pass to leave the camp and go to, for example, to see a doctor in Amman or to visit family in Amman. And so, when they leave the camp, then they can access the data infrastructure. They don't even have to go that far outside the camp, and they can access data infrastructure, mobile data infrastructures. And so there's attempts to supplement access through either Wi-Fi or using community centers with internet access that are some ways that refugees in that circumstance could access mobile data, or not mobile data, but just the internet. And I have to say again, I mean, that was in a very particular context, right? One of significant concern for security on the part of the Jordanian government. And so we see that, context, the nature of the conflict, the expectation of the of the government, of UNHCR, of others about that particular kind of refugee population can lead to restrictions on access. And because that particular camp was close to the border, I think that there was even more concern about people going back and forth over the border, et cetera, that led to those restrictions. In comparison, in Uganda, which is a very friendly refugee hosting country, refugees have freedom of movement and freedom of employment. And so the national policies have an impact on connectivity, because where refugees can move around, I mean, it's almost, can we even talk about camp-based refugees?
Yeah.
And they actually don't call them camps, they call them settlements. And so it's important. But there we saw a very interesting phenomenon, that the influx of the 250,000 refugees from South Sudan up into the northwest of that country led to the build out of mobile infrastructure, which had, I think, important benefits for the host community. So they had been underserved for many, many years. And then we saw that this influx and lobbying by the aid agencies responding to that crisis led to an improved infrastructure and improved information access for everyone up in the northwest of the country.
Okay, yeah, so beneficial for not only refugees, but
the host
all the
community
population.
effects.
Yeah,
Yes, is very important. Very, very important.
Community, yeah, great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And okay, so last but not least, one of your most recent works focuses on the link between access to mobile phones and a sense of community.
Yes.
For refugees. Could you share the main reason why that is?
Yeah, I think that there are opportunities, particularly where with less affluent refugees who may need to share their mobile phones,
Mm-hmm.
that mobile phone sharing can help. The phone itself becomes like a locus of concern by one another. People might see somebody struggling with mobile phone use. They might ask to share. Can I, borrow your charger? Can I borrow your minutes? Can I borrow something? And so we see this sharing and mutual training. Do you know how to use this social media platform? I heard I can learn a new language on, this platform called YouTube or something. And so it helps bring people together because of their shared need for information through this medium.
Okay, yeah, that makes complete sense. But when I read your research, I was like, yeah, it's written in a way that appeared so logical to me, but then yet I hadn't created this idea, and I get thought through so far. I was
Yeah,
like, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
Um,
Well, we have, in more affluent communities and in the West, we have a more individual centric
mm,
perspective on technology use. So our mobile phones are highly individual, right?
yeah.
Even sometimes our kids have them themselves, so they're not asking to borrow, right? But in more resource constrained, households, that can even be in the U.S. It can be in wealthy countries.
Mm,
There is more sharing, right? There's
yeah.
more sharing of everything, and so that actually also applies to mobile phones.
Okay. Well, thank you for that answer. Just maybe one last question. Uh, why are information and communication technologies important for refugees in a few words? Yeah. Yeah,
just like
just do
all
that. You know,
of
that
us,
simple
just
thing.
like all of us. They're just like all of us, right?
Yeah,
And I
but
and I would be remiss if I did not point out the importance that they provide for
mm,
entertainment and relief of boredom, right?
mm,
Just like we use our phones to relieve our boredom, they can be very bored, especially in places where they're prohibited from working.
yeah.
There's a big issue with boredom. And so they do, provide helpful entertainment. They're very important for language learning. Movement, migration almost always requires learning a new language.
Mm.
And these tools, they're so helpful in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, in one of the Polish centers that we work in, one of the echoes that we have is that one of the first things Ukrainian refugees come and ask is, "How can I learn Polish?"
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
And Google Translate is, any translate, I shouldn't be
mm.
branding for Google here, but any translate is very helpful.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time and for your answers.
Thank you.
Do you have anything to add?
No, just thank you to TSF for the opportunity to share the findings of my research. And, I look forward to further interaction.